He thought she was just another easy target, just another black woman he could intimidate. But the moment he laid a hand on her, he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What happened next, no one saw coming. The night air was crisp, carrying a faint whisper of the city in the distance. Atlanta had its own rhythm, a blend of old and new, history and change. But here, in this quiet neighborhood, the world felt still. The streetlights hummed softly, their yellow glow casting long shadows across manicured lawns and parked cars. Ava Thompson walked at a steady pace, hands tucked into the pockets of her light jacket. She had always found a strange sense of calm in the night, when the world seemed to slow down just enough for her to breathe. It was one of the few routines she had managed to maintain over the years. Even after everything, her time in the CIA had taught her to read a room, to sense a shift in energy before anything even happened. And tonight, something felt off. She first noticed it as she turned onto the next street. The low rumble of an engine, the faint glow of headlights reflecting off the pavement. A police cruiser, moving just slow enough to be noticeable. Ava didn't react. She kept walking, kept her breathing steady. The car followed. She had seen this before. Years of working in counterintelligence had made her intimately familiar with surveillance. Both the kind that came from professionals and the kind that came from men who thought a badge gave them unchecked authority. This was the latter, a quiet game of cat and mouse, where the mouse was expected to act small, to shrink beneath the weight of expectation. Ava didn't shrink. She crossed the street, her eyes flicking to the side just enough to catch the details. The cruiser was an older model, the kind that had been phased out in some precincts but still lingered in others. The officer inside sat back, fingers tapping against the steering wheel, watching, waiting. She knew what came next. The headlights brightened for a second as the car rolled forward, closing the gap between them. She turned another corner. The car turned, too. Ava's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. If this was what she thought it was, then she had two options. Keep walking and let him feel like he was in control, or stop and take that control away. She chose the latter. Slowing her steps, she came to a full stop at the edge of the sidewalk. The cruiser hesitated for a moment before pulling up alongside her. The driver's window rolled down. Ava didn't move. The man inside was exactly what she expected. White, mid-40s, a strong build that suggested years of being on the job. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the streetlight. But it was his expression that told her everything. Curiosity, suspicion, ownership. Jake Miller. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who didn't ask questions because they already thought they knew the answers. Men who mistook quiet for compliance. Ava didn't give him the satisfaction of being the first to speak. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Then, slowly, Miller leaned forward. "Evening, ma'am." It wasn't a greeting. It was an opening move. Ava didn't blink. "Evening, officer." Miller tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning her face, her posture, her hands. He was looking for something. Nervousness, discomfort, an excuse. He didn't find it. "You live around here?" he asked. Ava let a beat pass before answering. "I do." Miller didn't seem satisfied with that. His fingers drummed lazily against the door of his car. Where exactly? Ava knew this game, knew the way it worked. He wanted her to justify her presence, to prove she belonged. She wasn't going to. "I wasn't aware I needed to check in." Miller's jaw tightened just slightly. It was subtle, but she caught it, a flicker of irritation. "That so?" His voice was smooth, almost amused. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Ava met his gaze, unflinching. "And what job is that?" Miller let out a slow breath through his nose, like a man deciding whether or not something was worth his time. Finally, he sat back in his seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel again. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said. Ava held his gaze for another second before speaking. "Everything is." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The street was quiet, the tension thick. Then, just as slowly as he had pulled up, Miller shifted the car into gear. "Have a good night," he said, voice edged with something that wasn't quite a threat but wasn't far from it. Ava didn't respond. She didn't have to. As Miller drove away, She didn't miss the way his headlights lingered just a little too long before disappearing around the next turn. She exhaled through her nose, rolling her shoulders back. This wasn't over. The night had settled into an uneasy stillness, the kind that made everything feel heavier, as if the air itself carried weight. Ava had hoped that her exchange with Officer Miller was over, that he had satisfied whatever suspicion had crept into his mind. But as she turned onto the next street, the sudden blare of a police siren shattered the silence. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the pavement ahead of her, casting flickering shadows along the sidewalk. The low growl of the patrol car's engine followed as it rolled up beside her, forcing her to stop. Ava took a slow breath before turning to face him. Miller stepped out of the car, moving with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. It was in the way he carried himself, the slight shift of his shoulders as he adjusted his belt, his hand resting just inches from his holstered weapon. He didn't speak right away. He let the moment stretch, his gaze running over her as if trying to find something out of place. "Evening again," he finally said, his voice flat. Ava kept her expression neutral. "Officer." Miller took another step forward. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Did I do something wrong?" Miller gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Just making sure everything checks out." She knew that tone. It wasn't about protocol. It was about control. "I wasn't aware walking in my own neighborhood required ID," she said. Miller's jaw tensed. "It's a simple request." Ava didn't move. "And yet, it's not a request you make to everyone." A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he masked it. He took another step closer, lowering his voice. "You live around here?" She held his gaze. "I do." Miller let out a slow breath, like a man indulging a difficult conversation. "Then you shouldn't have a problem answering a few questions." She could feel it now, the subtle shift in power he was trying to establish, the way he was pushing for submission, not information. "What do you do for work?" he asked. Ava paused just long enough for the question to land. "Consulting." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Consulting," he repeated, as if the word itself was suspect. "Yes." Miller studied her for a long moment. Then, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't think I've seen you around before," he said, "and I know most of the people who live here." Ava didn't take the bait. She simply nodded. "Then I guess we're meeting for the first time." Miller's fingers tapped idly against his belt. "You got a bag with you?" Ava's spine stiffened just slightly. "I do. Mind if I take a look?" The request, if it could even be called that, hung in the air between them. Ava knew her rights, and she knew that Miller was counting on her not wanting to escalate things. But compliance would mean something else entirely. "If I haven't done anything wrong," she said evenly, "then you don't have the right to search my belongings." Miller's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A quiet frustration. He had expected submission, and he wasn't getting it. "Just trying to do my job," he said. "Then do it," Ava replied, "but do it legally." A brief silence. Miller's gaze flicked past her shoulder for the first time, and Ava caught the slight hesitation in his stance. Someone was watching. She followed his line of sight. A man stood at the window of a house across the street, his face partially obscured by the reflection of the porch light. He wasn't coming outside, but he was there, and he had seen. Miller's jaw worked for a moment. Then, just as suddenly as he had stopped her, he took a step back. "All right," he said, his voice almost casual. "Enjoy your night." But as he turned to leave, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Tread carefully," he said, his tone lighter than it should have been. "We'll be keeping an eye on you." Ava didn't reply. She watched as he slid back into his cruiser, the headlights illuminating the pavement once more before the car pulled away. She stood there for a long moment, letting the night settle around her again. This wasn't over. The first night, Ava dismissed it as a coincidence. She noticed the patrol car parked a few houses down from hers, engine idling, headlights off. It wasn't unusual to see police in the neighborhood, but something about the way it lingered felt off. By the second night, she knew it wasn't a coincidence at all. The car was there again. Same spot, same officer behind the wheel. Jake Miller wasn't done with her. Ava kept her blinds partially open, watching as he sat in the vehicle, unmoving. He didn't knock on her door, Didn't call her out. He didn't have to. His presence alone sent the message. She refused to let him rattle her. But she also knew that men like Miller didn't operate on patience. They escalated. And he did. Sooner than she expected. The following morning, Ava left her house early, intent on keeping some distance between herself and the suffocating presence outside her home. She drove to a small cafe she often visited, a place where she could clear her head over a quiet cup of coffee. She barely made it into the parking lot before she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her hands tightened on the wheel as she pulled into a spot. She took a breath, keeping her expression neutral as Miller approached her window. He was relaxed this time, almost casual, like they were two acquaintances running into each other by chance. "Morning," he said, tapping the roof of her car lightly. "License and registration." Ava didn't move right away. "Is there a problem, officer?" Miller gave a lazy shrug. "Got a report about a vehicle matching this description. Something about suspicious activity." She let a beat pass before speaking. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Miller smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what I'm here to find out." Ava exhaled slowly, suppressing the frustration rising in her chest. She knew exactly what this was. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, tone still light, but with an edge that told her he wasn't asking. Ava debated her options. Legally, he had no probable cause. But refusing could escalate things in a way she wasn't willing to risk, at least. Not yet. She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with careful movements. Miller gave her a once-over before glancing toward the approaching officer, someone younger. Clearly unsure but playing along. "Mind popping the trunk for me?" Miller asked. Ava folded her arms. "I do, actually." Miller tilted his head, pretending to consider her response. "I can call in a warrant," he said. "That's a lot of paperwork for both of us. Though." Ava met his gaze, unflinching. "Then get your paperwork." For a long second, they stared at each other. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing this wasn't the routine stop Miller had made it out to be. Miller finally exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Not worth my time." He stepped back, signaling to his colleague. "No problem here," he said, voice carrying just enough for bystanders to hear. "But you have yourself a good day." "Ma'am." Ava didn't move until they were gone. She had won this round. But she also knew it wasn't the last. That evening, she made a call. She hadn't spoken to Marcus Reed in years. But if there was anyone who could give her insight into what she was dealing with, it was him. They met at his office, a modest space lined with legal books and stacks of case files. Marcus leaned back in his chair after hearing her out, fingers steepled in thought. "Miller's a problem," he admitted, "but not the problem." Ava frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed. "He's not working alone. Cops like him don't operate in isolation. If he's coming after you this hard, it's because he knows he's protected." Ava absorbed that information, even though it didn't surprise her. "He's been accused before," Marcus continued, tapping his fingers on his desk. "Mostly harassment cases, stopping black residents for no reason. Trumped up charges, but nothing ever sticks. He's got people covering for him." Ava exhaled. "And if I push back?" Marcus looked at her, serious now. "Then you better have something solid," he said, "because if you don't, you won't just be going after Miller. You'll be going after whoever's been keeping him in power." Later that night, Ava sat in front of her laptop, sifting through old complaints, trying to piece together a pattern. That was when she found it. A name. Daniel Carter. A man who had filed a complaint against Miller years ago, claiming wrongful arrest and physical intimidation. The case had been quietly dismissed. She dug deeper, tracing his history. Then, she found something worse. Daniel Carter had spent 3 months in jail on false charges. And by the time he got out, he had lost his job, his apartment, and his willingness to fight back. Ava leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of it. Miller had been doing this for years, and no one had ever stopped him. Yet, Ava had spent years in the intelligence world, uncovering secrets people had gone to great lengths to bury. She had followed paper trails across continents, traced whispers through encrypted messages, and pulled threads that led to powerful men falling. This was different. This wasn't happening in a war zone or the shadows of foreign governments. This was her own backyard. And somehow, it felt more dangerous. She sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. It had been hours since she started digging through old case files, cross-referencing complaints and legal documents. Most of them led nowhere, missing pages, cases dismissed on technicalities, internal investigations that conveniently found no wrongdoing. But then she found a name. Terrence Lawson. He had been arrested 3 years ago on charges that were never clearly outlined. Detained overnight. The next morning, he was dead. The official report stated suicide. The autopsy backed it up. Case closed. Except for one detail. The arresting officer that night was Jake Miller. Ava's pulse quickened. She pulled up the medical examiner's report, scrolling through the details. Cause of death: strangulation by bedsheet. No signs of struggle. No external injuries. It was too clean, too convenient. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Terrence Lawson had been a community organizer, known for speaking out against police misconduct. He had been vocal about corruption within the department, about officers who abused their power. And then, one night, he was pulled over for broken taillight and never made it home. Ava had seen enough crime scenes to know when something didn't add up. She clicked through more records, searching for any signs of internal reviews. But there was nothing, just silence. Terrence Lawson had been erased, and Miller had walked away without a scratch. The next evening, Ava checked her home security system before heading to bed. She had taken precautions before, but this was different. She wasn't just a potential target, she was officially on Miller's radar. Something gnawed at the back of her mind as she locked the front door. A feeling she couldn't shake. She stepped into the garage, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of metal and oil. The quiet hum of the street just beyond the walls. Then she saw it. The latch on the side door was off by half an inch. Ava stilled. Her fingers hovered over the keypad near the doorframe. The alarm had been set. No alerts. No forced entry detected. But the door had been touched. Someone had been inside. She moved carefully, scanning the space. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. But that wasn't the point. Miller wasn't looking for something. He was letting her know he could get in. Ava clenched her jaw, forcing down the anger rising in her chest. She had seen intimidation tactics before. Officers who thought their badge gave them the right to terrorize people into silence. She had never been one to scare easily. But Miller had made a mistake. He thought he was the one in control. Ava had spent her career studying men like him. And now, she was going to turn the game around. That night, she installed hidden cameras inside and outside her house, making sure every entry point was covered. If Miller came back, she would be ready. The next day, Marcus called her, his voice tight. "I got a message," he said. No caller ID, no traceable number. Ava's grip tightened on her phone. What did it say? Marcus hesitated. "Walk away from this, or you won't get another warning." Ava exhaled slowly. "They're making their move. It gets worse." Marcus paused. "Daniel Carter got pulled over this morning. Cops took him in for an outstanding ticket, except he didn't have any." Ava didn't need to hear the rest. They were sending a message. Miller wasn't working alone. There was an entire network behind him. A system that had been protecting men like him for years. And now, that system was turning its sights on her. That night, she found something waiting for her at her front door. A plain manila envelope. No return address. No markings. She took it inside, peeled it open carefully. Inside was a stack of documents, photocopied police reports, and a list of names. At the bottom of the last page, a single handwritten note. "It's bigger than him. Be careful." Ava scanned the documents, her heart pounding. Miller's name was there, but so were others. Officers, detectives, even high-ranking officials. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was a machine. And someone, whoever had sent her this, wanted her to dismantle it. Ava had spent the past 2 days locked in her home office, dissecting the documents from the anonymous sender. The deeper she went, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about Miller. The files outlined a network within the Atlanta Police Department, a tightly woven structure of officers protecting each other. covering up violent arrests, and ensuring that certain cases never made it past internal review. It wasn't sloppy corruption, it was systematic. And at the center of it all was a connection to an organization operating outside the law, using the police force as a shield for their activities. Miller wasn't leading it, he was a soldier in a much larger army. She needed proof, real proof. The kind that couldn't be ignored, the kind that forced action. But proof meant time, and Ava had a feeling she was running out of it. She wasn't wrong. The air outside was thick with the last traces of summer heat as she stepped out of the cafe. A to-go cup of coffee in one hand, keys in the other. The street was quiet, just the hum of passing cars and distant chatter. That was when she saw them. 2 patrol officers, parked a few spots away. They hadn't been there when she arrived. Ava's instincts flared, but she kept her pace steady as she approached her car. She was 3 steps from the driver's side door when she heard it. "Ma'am," a voice called. She stopped. One of the officers, a stocky man with a buzz cut, gestured toward her. His partner, leaner, younger, stood a step behind, hands resting on his belt. "Need you to step away from the vehicle," the first officer said. "Just a routine check." Ava turned, keeping her expression neutral. "Routine for what?" "Had a call about a car matching this description," he said, his tone casual. "Mind popping the trunk for us?" Ava exhaled slowly. This was a setup. "Unless you have probable cause," she said. "I'd rather not." The officer's jaw ticked slightly. "Not asking." "Ma'am." The second officer moved then, stepping around to the passenger side of her car. The first one stayed close to her, blocking her path. Ava clenched her jaw but complied, stepping back as ordered. The taller officer circled around, his hands moving fast, too fast. A flick of his wrist, and something small disappeared into the crease of her trunk before he pulled the latch. He turned back to the first officer. "Got something?" Ava's stomach twisted. They had planted it. The first officer glanced inside, let out a low whistle, and then turned back to her. "That's not good." Ava kept her face unreadable, but her mind was racing. "What exactly am I looking at here?" she asked evenly. The officer tilted his head. "Illegal possession." He stepped closer. "Which means you're under arrest." The ride to the precinct was quiet. Ava sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists bound, eyes trained on the city passing by. She had expected a move against her. She just hadn't expected it to happen this fast. By the time they pulled into the station, Marcus had already been alerted. She saw him through the glass as she was led inside, arguing with a desk sergeant. But there was nothing he could do. Not yet. She was processed quickly, too quickly. Like this had been planned. They took her into an interrogation room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The cuffs stayed on, and then the door opened. Miller stepped inside. He looked at her for a moment before shaking his head, a slow, smug smile stretching across his face. "Welcome to the system, Ms. Thompson," he said. "Let's talk." The air in the interrogation room was stale, thick with the scent of old coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every few minutes, casting brief shadows against the dull gray walls. Ava sat motionless in the metal chair, her hands resting lightly on the cold surface of the table. The cuffs had been removed, but the indentation on her wrists still lingered. She had been sitting there for over an hour, maybe 2. No questions, no lawyer, no movement beyond the occasional shadow passing by the one-way mirror. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a message. Ava had seen this tactic before. She had used it herself in past operations, leaving a suspect alone with nothing but their thoughts, letting time and silence do the work of breaking them down. But she wasn't a suspect, and she wasn't about to break. She shifted slightly, rolling the tension out of her shoulders. If this was a game, she would wait them out. Another 30 minutes passed before the door finally creaked open. Jake Miller stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might want one," he said, placing one in front of her before sinking into the chair across from her. "Black, no sugar, just a guess." Ava didn't touch it. Miller took a slow sip from his own cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "Rough night?" he asked, voice smooth, conversational. Ava tilted her head slightly. "You tell me, you're the one who planned it." Miller chuckled. shaking his head. See, that's what I like about you. You don't play dumb. Ava said nothing. Miller leaned back in his chair, stretching one arm across the backrest, looking as comfortable as if they were two old colleagues catching up. You're a smart woman, he continued. I'm sure you've figured out by now that this isn't really about some drugs in your car. Ava raised an eyebrow. No? Miller smirked. Come on. You and I both know that bag didn't belong to you. Hell, I'm pretty sure you knew the second you saw it. Ava kept her expression unreadable. So, Miller said, taking another sip of coffee. That means you also know why you're really here. Ava exhaled lightly. Indulge me. Miller placed his cup down carefully, tapping a finger against the rim. You've been digging where you shouldn't be, poking around in things that don't concern you. Ava met his gaze evenly. You seem pretty concerned. Miller chuckled again, but there was something sharper in it this time. See, that's the thing, he said. This isn't concern. This is courtesy. He let that sit in the air between them for a moment before continuing. You're a smart woman, he repeated, which means I don't have to spell this out for you. People who push too hard, they tend to end up in unfortunate situations. Ava tilted her head slightly. Like Terrence Lawson? It was subtle, the way Miller's fingers twitched against the table. But she caught it. His smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. That name doesn't ring a bell. Ava leaned forward just slightly, lowering her voice. Then maybe I should remind you. Miller's eyes darkened, the pretense of friendliness slipping just a little. You really think you're going to change anything? He asked, his voice quieter now. That you're going to win? Ava's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Are you sure I haven't already? She let the question hang, watching the slight shift in his posture, the way his jaw tensed. Then she delivered the final push. You have no idea how many copies I've made, she said casually, or where I've sent them. The silence that followed was thick. For the first time since walking in, Miller looked like he was recalculating. Ava had nothing, no extra copies, no additional evidence beyond what she had already gathered. But Miller didn't know that. And judging by the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, he wasn't willing to risk it. After a long moment, Miller exhaled, shaking his head. You really are a pain in the ass. Ava didn't respond. Miller stood, grabbing his cup as he did. Well, he said, stepping toward the door, I think we're done here. 15 minutes later, she was walking out of the precinct, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She was free, but not safe. Miller wouldn't let this go. If anything, he would double down, and that meant she had to move faster. She barely made it 3 steps before a voice stopped her. Ms. Thompson. Ava turned. A man stood just beyond the street lamp's glow, dressed in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets. He stepped forward, his face partially illuminated now, older, weathered, eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper, extending it to her. You can't win this alone, he said quietly. Find me when you're ready. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. Ava looked down at the paper in her hand. One name, one address. The game had just changed. Ava didn't waste time. The name on the slip of paper, Samuel Ortiz, wasn't just another unknown player. She found his personnel file buried deep in old police records. He had been a decorated officer, served over 20 years, and then, 3 years ago, he walked away. No scandal, no media coverage, just an abrupt resignation under the vague explanation of personal reasons. That alone was enough to raise suspicion. People like Ortiz didn't just disappear, not unless they had a reason to. It took her the better part of the day to locate the address tied to his name. The bar sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between a boarded-up auto shop and an empty parking lot. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, casting a dull glow onto the cracked pavement. Ava stepped inside, immediately greeted by the scent of stale beer and smoke. A handful of patrons were scattered across the room, heads bowed over drinks, conversations kept low. A television in the corner played an old boxing match, the static cutting in and out. And then she saw him. Samuel Ortiz sat alone in a booth near the back, a half-empty glass in front of him. He was older than she expected, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with exhaustion. She approached cautiously, keeping her movements unthreatening. Ortiz barely looked up as she slid into the seat across from him. "If you're here for a drink," he muttered, swirling the liquid in his glass, "you're in the wrong place." Ava studied him carefully. "I'm here for answers." That got his attention. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You don't want answers, lady. You want confirmation. And I'm telling you now, you don't need it." Ava leaned forward. "You knew Miller." Ortiz went still. For a moment, she thought he might get up and walk away. Instead, he let out a slow sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah," he admitted, "I knew him." Ava waited, giving him space to speak. Ortiz stared at his drink for a long moment before finally looking up. "I was a cop for 25 years. He said, believed in the job, believed in doing things right." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Then I met guys like Miller." Ava didn't interrupt. Ortiz continued, voice lower now. "I saw what he was doing. How he handled suspects. How certain cases disappeared. I filed a complaint once." He exhaled. "Big mistake." Ava narrowed her eyes. "What happened?" Ortiz took another sip of his drink before answering. "They came after me," he said simply. "At first, it was small things, messing with my paperwork, reassigning me to dead-end cases. Then it got worse." Ava recognized the pattern. "They tried to force you out." Ortiz huffed a humorless laugh. "Tried? No. They succeeded." He finally met her gaze fully. "They planted evidence, turned me into the bad guy. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. Suddenly, I was looking at prison time." Ava felt a cold chill run through her. "You fought it?" Ortiz smirked. "I was lucky to get out alive." Ava sat back, absorbing his words. This wasn't just about Miller. It never had been. Ortiz read her expression and sighed. "Look, I get it. You think you can take them down. Maybe you even got something on them." Ava didn't deny it. "But trust me," Ortiz continued, voice heavy, "you don't have enough." Ava studied him. "Then tell me what I need." Ortiz hesitated, fingers tapping lightly against the glass. Then, finally, he leaned in. "There's a storage facility on the east side of town," he said. "Old warehouse. Cops used it as a dumping ground for seized evidence before the paperwork caught up. Some things never made it back into the system." Ava's pulse quickened. "What's inside?" Ortiz gave a tired smile. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." Before she could ask more, Ortiz's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. Ava didn't need to see the message to know what it was. Ortiz slowly put his phone away, then slid out of the booth. "This conversation never happened," he said quietly. Ava grabbed his wrist before he could leave. "Ortiz." He pulled free. "I can't help you," he murmured. "Not anymore." Without another word, he walked out, disappearing into the night. Ava stared at the empty glass he left behind, her mind already moving a mile a minute. She had her next lead. But she wasn't the only one paying attention. The warehouse sat at the edge of the city, a forgotten structure swallowed by time and neglect. Its metal exterior was rusted, the paint peeling in uneven streaks. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, its gate hanging loosely on broken hinges. Ava parked a block away, keeping her car out of sight. She had dressed for the occasion: dark jeans, a fitted jacket, gloves to avoid leaving prints. The air smelled of damp concrete and old metal as she approached the entrance. She had been inside places like this before, places meant to be abandoned but never truly empty. The lock on the side door had already been broken. A bad sign. She stepped inside, moving carefully through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, the faint scent of mildew clinging to old paper. Stacks of forgotten evidence sat in uneven piles, some in cardboard boxes, others spilling onto the floor. This was where things went to disappear. Ava moved with purpose, scanning labels and file numbers. She needed something. Anything. That tied Miller to the larger corruption inside the department. Then she saw it. A metal filing cabinet shoved against the far wall. Its drawers rusted shut from years of neglect. But one drawer had been forced open, its contents spilling onto the floor. She crouched down, sifting through the mess. Old reports, disciplinary records, most of them faded beyond recognition. And then, buried beneath the others. She found it. A file marked with an old case number. Nearly lost in the chaos. She flipped it open, eyes narrowing as she skimmed the contents. Dozens of names, dates, arrests that had never made it to trial. And Miller's name appeared over and over again. Not just as the arresting officer, but as someone who had signed off on reports that never led anywhere. And then she saw the final entry. A handwritten note, scrawled in the margins of one page. Investigation suspended by order of Deputy Chief S.H. Ava's pulse quickened. S.H. Samuel Hayes. She had heard his name before. A high-ranking officer known for protecting his own. If he was shielding Miller, then this was bigger than she had imagined. She took out her phone, snapping quick photos of every page. She would go through them later, piece together the full picture. But just as she reached the last page, she heard it. Footsteps. Ava's body went still, her instincts kicking in immediately. She moved swiftly, shoving the folder back into the mess, making it look untouched. The footsteps grew louder, more than one person. She slipped behind a row of metal shelves, pressing her back against the cool surface, slowing her breathing. A beam of light swept across the room. Check everything, a voice murmured. Ava glanced toward the entrance. 4 men, no uniforms, no badges. This wasn't an official police visit. She scanned the room, searching for an exit. The main door was out of the question. But on the far end of the warehouse, she spotted it. A rusted emergency exit, barely visible in the dim light. She moved quickly, staying low, weaving between stacks of old paperwork. One of the men stepped closer. Someone was here, he muttered. Ava didn't wait for them to find her. She darted for the exit, twisting the handle just as she heard a voice shout behind her. Hey! She pushed through, her boots hitting pavement as she sprinted toward the alley behind the building. A shout, the scuffle of footsteps behind her. Ava didn't look back. She drove home in silence, gripping the wheel tightly. She had what she needed, but she had also been seen. They knew she was looking. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed. Blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep voice filled the line. Low and steady. You're playing with fire, Thompson, the man said. Burn the wrong thing, and you'll go up in flames too. The call ended. Ava sat there, the weight of the warning settling over her. She wasn't just investigating anymore. She was being hunted. Ava hadn't slept. She sat at her dining table, papers spread out before her, the glow from her laptop casting long shadows across the room, the weight of what she had uncovered pressed against her ribs like a tightening vice. Names, dates, cases that had vanished without a trace. Every document led back to the same conclusion. Miller wasn't the mastermind. He was a piece in something bigger, a machine designed to protect itself at all costs. And now, that machine knew her name. She traced a finger over one particular file. The one with the handwritten note. Investigation suspended by order of Deputy Chief S.H. Samuel Hayes. A man with power. Enough to bury evidence. Enough to make problems disappear. Enough to make her disappear if she wasn't careful. Her phone buzzed beside her. An email. She opened it, her pulse quickening at the sender. Unknown. No subject. Just one line of text. Meet me if you want to survive. Attached was a location. A parking garage in the city center. Ava exhaled slowly. A setup? Possibly. But she couldn't afford to ignore it. She shut her laptop, pocketed her phone, and grabbed her jacket. Time to see who was watching. The parking garage was nearly empty when she arrived. The concrete walls stained with years of exhaust fumes. A flickering overhead light buzzed above her as she moved cautiously toward the designated spot. She wasn't alone. A man stood by a black sedan, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. His posture was relaxed, but there was tension in the way he held himself, like someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. Ava kept a safe distance. You sent the email? The man turned to face her fully. His face was lined, his graying hair cut short. Mark Holloway, he said. You don't know me, but I know you. Ava narrowed her eyes. The name wasn't familiar, but there was something about him. Something in the way he carried himself that felt familiar. Who are you? She asked. Holloway exhaled, glancing around before stepping closer. I used to be internal affairs. Ava's stomach tightened. That was a long time ago. He continued. I tried to go after Miller once. Thought I could take him down before he became untouchable. Ava studied him carefully. And? Holloway let out a humorless chuckle. And I don't work for the department anymore. He reached into his coat. And Ava tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a thin folder. Whatever you found in that warehouse. It's just the surface, he said, holding it out to her. Ava hesitated before taking it, flipping it open under the dim garage light. She skimmed the pages, her breath catching as she reached the final report. A name she hadn't expected. James Mathers. She looked up sharply. This was the witness in the Lawson case. Holloway nodded. Mathers had been the only person willing to testify about Terrence Lawson's arrest. The only one who had spoken out about what really happened that night. And now, buried deep in these files, was proof that Mathers hadn't simply disappeared. He had been murdered. The official report ruled it an accident. A car crash. No foul play suspected. But the autopsy told a different story. Blunt force trauma, signs of restraint, and the arresting officer the night before? Jake Miller. Ava clenched her jaw, gripping the folder tighter. If you want to take them down, Holloway said, his voice low. This is your chance. Ava looked at him, her mind already racing. This wasn't just corruption. This was murder. And now, she had the proof. Ava sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as the weight of her decision settled in. She had spent her career exposing corruption in foreign governments, dismantling criminal networks, and staying one step ahead of men who thought they were untouchable. Now, the fight was at home. And she wasn't just facing one corrupt cop. She was up against an entire system built to protect itself. Her first call was to Marcus Reed. The line clicked after 2 rings. Tell me you're safe, he said, voice tight with worry. For now, Ava replied, but that's not why I'm calling. She told him about Holloway. About the new evidence linking Miller to a cover-up far worse than they had imagined. We need to go public, she said, not just about Miller, about everything. Marcus exhaled sharply. You realize what that means? It means they won't be able to bury this, Ava said, not if we move fast enough. A beat of silence. Then Marcus spoke again, quieter this time. I know a guy, investigative journalist. He's been after corruption in the department for years. If we get this to him, he'll run it. Ava nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Set it up. They had less time than she thought. Hours later, news broke, but it wasn't about Miller. It was about her. Ava watched the live broadcast from her laptop, heart pounding as the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference. A senior officer stood at the podium, his expression grave. Behind him, the city's police chief and other high-ranking officials flanked his sides. We take any allegations of misconduct seriously, he began, voice measured, but we also cannot allow misinformation to undermine the integrity of our officers. Then the screen changed. A grainy surveillance video played. Ava, standing outside her car, facing 2 uniformed officers. Except the video had been altered. The footage was cut, edited to show only what they wanted the public to see. In this version, Ava looked aggressive, refusing commands. The moment she turned away, an officer stumbled back, as if she had pushed him. A voiceover followed. Ava Thompson, a former government operative, is now wanted for questioning in relation to multiple incidents involving law enforcement. Her stomach twisted. They had framed her. Then came the final blow. A newscaster reappeared on screen, holding a printed statement. The Atlanta PD has issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of obstruction and inciting public disorder. Ava closed her laptop, her pulse pounding in her ears. They weren't just trying to silence her. They were turning her into the enemy. She was out of her apartment before the first patrol cars arrived. By the time they knocked on her door, she was already blocks away, moving quickly through side streets, avoiding cameras and major roads. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, tell me you're not at home, he said the moment she answered. I'm already gone, she replied. Marcus swore under his breath. They're making this personal. They're making this desperate. Ava corrected. They wouldn't be doing this if they weren't afraid. Doesn't matter, Marcus said. You can't stay here. If they catch you, everything disappears. The files, the witnesses, all of it. She knew he was right. Then I need somewhere to lay low, she said. There was a pause. Then Marcus sighed. I might have something. Ava was halfway out of the city when her phone buzzed again. Blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. No voice, no breathing. Then a message, spoken low and steady. There's someone who can help you. A brief pause. But you need to find him now. Ava gripped the phone tighter. Who? The call ended. A second later, a text came through. An address. She stared at it, the words blurring slightly under the dim light of the highway. Whoever had sent it, they weren't with the police. Which meant she had only one choice. Find them first. The house sat at the end of a quiet road, nestled between thick trees and overgrown grass. It wasn't abandoned, but it might as well have been. The windows were covered, the porch light off, the kind of place people passed without a second glance. Ava parked 2 blocks away, her instincts telling her to stay cautious. She stepped out, scanning her surroundings. No unfamiliar cars, no movement in the shadows. Still, she didn't go straight to the door. Instead, she circled the property once, checking for exits, looking for signs that someone had been here before her. Only when she was sure she hadn't been followed did she approach the entrance. She knocked twice. Silence. Then, the faint sound of footsteps. A pause. A shift behind the door. A chain slid free, and the door cracked open just enough for her to see a pair of wary eyes staring back at her. The man inside didn't speak at first, just studied her, suspicion etched into every line on his face. Elijah Grant? Ava asked, keeping her voice low. The man stiffened. Who are you? Someone who wants the same thing you do. She replied, justice. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, he stepped aside, allowing her in. Inside, the house was sparse, lived in but not comfortably. The furniture was old, the walls bare. A single duffel bag sat near the door, half-packed, as if he had been ready to leave at a moment's notice. Ava turned to face him fully. Elijah Grant was older than she expected. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. His hair was cropped short, streaked with gray. His eyes were sharp but tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from looking over your shoulder for too long. You're supposed to be dead, Ava said. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. That was the plan. She studied him. Then why are you still here? Elijah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Because disappearing isn't the same as forgetting. He glanced at her. And because I knew this day would come. Ava pulled out her phone. Someone sent me here. Who? Elijah shook his head. Doesn't matter. What matters is why. He turned, moving to a small desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a flash drive. This, he said, holding it up, is why I had to disappear. Ava took it carefully. What's on it? Elijah leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. A conversation. Ava inserted the drive into her laptop, pulling up the only file inside, a single audio recording. She pressed play. At first, just static. Then, voices. One she recognized immediately. Jake Miller. The other? Samuel Hayes. Ava's stomach tightened. Don't care what happens to him. Miller's voice crackled through the speaker. We need this to go away. A pause. Then Hayes spoke. Handle it. Miller again, his tone edged with frustration. It won't be clean. I said handle it, Hayes repeated, and make sure it never comes back to me. Then, silence. Ava looked up at Elijah, her pulse hammering in her ears. They were talking about James Mathers. He confirmed, the witness in the Lawson case. They ordered his murder. Ava clenched her jaw. This wasn't just corruption, it was conspiracy. And now, she had the proof. Before they could say another word, headlights flashed through the window. Ava moved first, shutting the laptop, stepping quickly to the curtains. Outside, an SUV had pulled up, idling on the street. Elijah joined her, his face pale. They found me, he whispered. Then, a hard knock at the door. Ava reached for her gun. Ava moved first. The second the knock came, she grabbed Elijah by the arm and pulled him toward the back of the house. His steps were sluggish, but fear quickened his pace. They found me, he repeated, breathless. Yeah, and they're not here to talk. Ava muttered, scanning for an exit. The front door shuddered as someone rammed against it. Once, twice. Then it exploded inward. 4 men stormed in. Black tactical gear. No badges. No insignias. Professionals. Ava shoved Elijah toward the back door. Move. But before they could reach it, the first shot rang out. Elijah stumbled as the bullet tore into his shoulder, knocking him off balance. Ava twisted around, gun already drawn. The first man leveled his weapon, but he was too slow. Ava fired once, center mass, and he crumpled. The second man lunged at her. She sidestepped, using his momentum against him, slamming an elbow into his throat. He collapsed, choking for air. The remaining 2 advanced. Elijah, despite the pain, raised his own gun with his good arm and squeezed the trigger. The shot wasn't perfect, but it was enough to send the third man staggering back. That left 1. Ava barely had time to react before he swung at her, the weight of his body slamming her into the wall. The impact sent her gun skidding across the floor. He pressed an arm to her throat, trying to cut off her air. Ava's vision blurred at the edges, but she forced her body to move. Her knee snapped up, hitting his ribs. His grip loosened just enough. She grabbed the knife from his belt and drove it into his side. The man let out a strangled gasp, his grip faltering. Ava twisted the blade, then shoved him off. He hit the floor, unmoving. Elijah was leaning against the kitchen counter, blood seeping through his shirt. "We need to go," he rasped. Ava nodded, grabbing the USB from the table before helping him up. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Not good. They stumbled out the back, slipping into the shadows before reinforcements arrived. Ava hotwired the first car she found, a beaten-up sedan that had seen better days. It would do. She peeled away from the house just as more vehicles pulled up. Elijah groaned beside her, clutching his wound. "You're not dying," she told him, voice flat. "That's comforting," he muttered, wincing. Ava checked her phone. A new message from Marcus. "I have bad news. Miller knows you have the recording." Her grip tightened on the wheel. They weren't just chasing her anymore. Now, they wanted her gone. The safe house was nothing more than a rundown cabin on the outskirts of the city. The walls smelled of damp wood. The floors creaked under every step. But for now, it was the only place where they wouldn't be found. Ava helped Elijah onto the couch, his breathing shallow, his hand pressing against the blood-soaked bandage on his shoulder. "You're going to be fine," she told him, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Elijah let out a weak chuckle. "That bad, huh?" Ava didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out her phone and sent a message to Marcus. "We need a doctor, now." Seconds later, the reply came. On it, Elijah shifted, wincing as he tried to sit up. "Ava, listen to me," he said, his voice rough but firm. "If you don't release that recording now, none of this will matter. They'll erase everything, and us along with it." She knew he was right. But going public wasn't as simple as uploading a file and hoping the truth would spread. If she played this wrong, Miller and his people would have time to spin the narrative, burying her before the evidence ever reached the public. She needed the right moment, the right strategy, and most of all, she needed Miller to think he was still in control. By morning, everything had changed. Ava woke to the sound of Marcus pacing in the next room, the television playing at low volume. She didn't need to ask. The look on his face said it all. "They escalated," he said, tossing his phone onto the table. Ava picked it up and scrolled through the headlines. "Fugitive on the run. Ex-CIA operative linked to domestic terror plot. Atlanta PD issues federal warrant for Ava Thompson. Authorities seek dangerous suspect in alleged police conspiracy." Every article painted the same picture. Ava wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a traitor. "They're calling you a national threat," Marcus said. "Feds are involved now." Ava exhaled slowly. She had expected Miller to hit back. But this was worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't just about silencing her. This was about making sure no one believed her, even if she lived long enough to tell the truth. Elijah groaned from the couch, shifting painfully. "Told you," he muttered. "They're burning the house down." Ava clenched her jaw. They wanted to control the narrative? Fine. She was going to take it from them. That afternoon, she sent the file. Not to one news outlet. Not to two. She sent it to 3 major newspapers, an investigative podcast, and an independent journalist known for exposing government corruption. But she didn't release it publicly. Not yet. She needed one more piece to make sure they couldn't cover it up. She needed Miller on record. The message was simple. We end this. Face to face. One-on-one. You want the recording? Come get it. The location. An abandoned parking lot on the edge of the city. No cameras. No civilians. The reply came 15 minutes later. See you there. Ava tucked her phone away. Marcus frowned. This is a trap. Of course it is, she said, but it's one I'm walking into with my eyes open. Night fell. Ava arrived first, stepping out of the stolen sedan and scanning the empty lot. She had been in places like this before. Quiet. Desolate. Designed for things that weren't meant to be seen. A car pulled up, then another. Miller stepped out first, his usual arrogance painted across his face. But Ava wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the figures emerging from the second vehicle. They weren't cops. They weren't Miller's usual muscle, either. They were federal agents. And standing in the center of them, dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, was Deputy Chief Samuel Hayes. Ava's pulse remained steady, but inside, she knew, this wasn't just about Miller anymore. She had stepped onto a battlefield much bigger than she had ever imagined. Miller stepped forward, his usual smirk plastered across his face. You really think you've won? He said, his voice dripping with amusement. You think this ends with me? Ava kept her stance firm, her expression unreadable. She had been in worse situations before. The key was control. Who had it and who thought they did? Right now, Miller believed it was him. Hayes, standing just a few feet behind Miller, didn't look amused. His face was unreadable, but Ava caught the subtle flick of his fingers. A silent signal. Miller didn't notice, but Ava did. She wasn't just dealing with a corrupt cop anymore. She was standing in the center of a power struggle. Hayes stepped forward. Ava Thompson, he said smoothly, you are under arrest. Two federal agents moved toward her. Ava didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her jacket. Not for a gun. For her phone. She tapped the screen twice. And suddenly, her voice filled the empty parking lot. Not her voice now, but her voice from a recording. The conversation. Miller and Hayes. Their own words. Undeniable. Playing out over a live broadcast. She saw the realization hit them both at the same time. This wasn't just a recording. It was streaming. To everyone. Miller's smirk vanished. What did you do? Ava slipped the phone back into her pocket. I just let the world hear the truth. The federal agents hesitated. Their earpieces buzzed with incoming chatter. Ava already knew what was happening. By now, the video was being shared across social media. Journalists were getting alerts. The recording couldn't be buried. Miller's fingers twitched toward his holster. His mind was racing, trying to calculate his way out of this. And then he snapped. His gun was halfway out before anyone could react. But the agents were reacting. Drop it. Put the weapon down. For the first time, Hayes didn't move to protect him. Miller realized it too late. No, he muttered under his breath. His gaze flicked to Hayes. But Hayes just stepped back. Miller had always thought he was protected. That there was always someone above him, pulling strings to keep him safe. But in moments like these, when power shifted, he was just another loose end. His hands shook. His gun hung uselessly at his side. And then, he dropped it. The agents tackled him, pinning him to the ground. Ava didn't move. She just watched. Miller fought at first, shouting something incoherent, but no one was listening. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. It was over. At least for him. Hayes turned. He adjusted his suit, as if this was just another minor inconvenience. And then he started walking away. No one stopped him. Not the agents. Not the officers who had arrived after Marcus leaked the documents. Because unlike Miller, Hayes still had power. Ava could take down a soldier. But the war? That was still going. She watched him go, already knowing. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The news broke within hours of Miller's arrest. Corrupt cop exposed. Officer involved in cover-ups. Whistleblower leaks damning evidence. But despite the headlines, the system remained intact. Miller had been sacrificed. But Hayes? Hayes walked away untouched. Miller sat in a holding cell, hands cuffed in his lap. eyes staring at the gray concrete walls. He was no longer the smug, untouchable officer Ava had first encountered. The charges against him were stacking up: abuse of power, falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice. But even now, he wasn't the one pulling the strings. His lawyer, paid for by unknown benefactors, was already working on a defense. And in the media, the narrative was shifting. Miller wasn't a symptom of a larger disease. He was being framed as one bad cop in an otherwise honorable system. Hayes had made sure of that. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the police department, the public wasn't staying silent. Protests erupted across Atlanta, fueled by outrage over the leaked audio. People held up signs with the names of past victims, those who had been brutalized, wrongfully imprisoned, or worse, never got the chance to tell their stories. More voices began coming forward. Former officers, victims, families of those who had been silenced. Each one had a story. Each one pointed to something much bigger than Miller. But Hayes? Hayes went on television, standing in front of a podium, denouncing Miller as a disgrace to the badge. "We do not tolerate corruption," he said with the conviction of a man who knew exactly how to play the game. Miller acted alone. Justice will be served. And the system let him walk away clean. Ava sat across from Marcus in a dimly lit safe house, staring at the screen of her laptop. The video had gone viral. The protests were growing. But Hayes was still in power. "He's untouchable," Marcus said, rubbing his temples. He knew exactly how this would play out. Elijah, still recovering from his wound, exhaled sharply. "That's why you need to let this go." Ava looked at him. "Let it go? You did what you could," he said. "You took down Miller. People are talking. But if you keep pushing, Hayes will come after you. And next time, he won't send cops to do it. He'll make sure you disappear." Ava didn't answer. Because deep down, she knew he was right. And yet, if she stopped now, the system would win. Miller was just a soldier. Hayes was the architect. And there were more like him. She had proof. She just needed one more move. That night, there was a knock at the door. Ava tensed. Marcus reached for his gun. But when they opened the door, no one was there. Only an envelope, lying on the ground. No return address. Just her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Ava unfolded it. One sentence, printed in bold black ink. "Do you really think you won?" And below it, a list of names. Cops, detectives, higher-ups, the ones who were still untouchable. Ava's grip tightened around the page. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Miller was sentenced to 20 years. His trial had been fast. The evidence overwhelming. The media framed it as a victory. Proof that justice worked. That bad cops got what they deserved. But Miller never talked. Not once. Not about Hayes. Not about the others. Not about the system that had protected him for years. And as soon as his cell door slammed shut, the headlines moved on. The department announced an internal review. A promise of reform. But behind closed doors, nothing changed. Ava sat in her car outside a small diner on the outskirts of the city, staring at her phone. She had just gotten a call. Not from Marcus. Not from Elijah. From a journalist. A big name in investigative reporting. Someone with the reach to take this story beyond just viral clips and fleeting protests. Someone who wanted to expose everything. "Help me finish this," the voice had said. Ava hadn't answered. Because this was the choice. The one she had been running from since the night Miller first stopped her on the street. Was she done? Or was this just the beginning? She drove home in silence, parking outside the small house she had barely spent time in over the past few weeks. Stepping inside, she set her keys on the counter. The list of names still in her jacket pocket. She could burn it. She could pretend this was over. Or, she could pull back another layer. See what else was hiding beneath. Ava reached into her pocket, fingers curling around the folded paper. And then, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. No name, no number, just a single message. "If you want the truth, I have what you need." Ava stared at the words, then exhaled. A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. The war wasn't over. Not yet. At the end of the day, Miller was just one piece of a much bigger system. A system that protects the powerful and silences those who dare to challenge it. Ava fought back, but was justice truly served? Or was this just another chapter in a cycle that never really ends? What do you think? Can real change happen? Or will corruption always find a way to survive? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories uncovering the hidden truths they don't want you to see, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths, because the fight for justice is far from over.